In the glittering maze of Hollywood, where fame often shields darkness and silence buys loyalty, a voice broke through in 2017 that would not be ignored. Cedric Bixler-Zavala, the enigmatic and impassioned frontman of the Mars Volta and At the Y Drive-In, stepped into the spotlight not with music, but with a truth that had haunted his home for years. In a series of raw, emotionally charged posts, he accused actor Danny Masterson, famed for his role in That '70s Show, of sexually assaulting his wife, actress, and former Scientologist Chrissie Carnell Bixler. The accusation was more than personal. It was a match thrown into a field of dry lies, and the fire it sparked would rage through the core of Hollywood's darkest secrets. Cedric had always been a man of intensity, his lyrics cryptic, his performances electric. But this time there was no metaphor to shield the pain. He named the alleged predator. He told the world that this wasn't just about justice, it was about survival. Chrissie, his wife, had carried the trauma for years, buried beneath shame, threats, and the looming shadow of the Church of Scientology, a powerful and controversial institution that Danny Masterson was deeply embedded in. For Cedric, speaking out was not only an act of love, it was an act of war. The first wave of attention came quickly. Headlines ran with shock. Social media exploded. Some fans stood with Cedric and Chrissie, offering support and outrage. Others recoiled, questioning motives, demanding proof. But Cedric was unwavering. His words were fierce, unapologetic, and filled with the fury of a man who had watched the woman he loved break under the weight of secrecy. In interviews and statements, Cedric revealed that Chrissie had been drugged and assaulted by Masterson while they were dating years earlier. She had tried to report the crime to authorities and to leaders within Scientology, only to be met with silence and suppression. According to them, she was told to stay quiet, to protect the image of the church, and to consider the consequences of speaking out. Those consequences had followed her into marriage, into motherhood, into therapy, and into years of emotional wreckage. Cedric had lived through it too. He watched his wife suffer panic attacks in the middle of the night. He saw her fear when unfamiliar cars parked outside their home. They changed phone numbers, moved houses, installed cameras, and lived with the constant anxiety that retaliation would come, not just from Masterson, but from the vast network of influence that protected him. The fear was real. So were the dead pets. Cedric later revealed that 2 of their dogs had been poisoned, one vomiting blood in his arm. He believed it was no coincidence. He believed they were being silenced, slowly and cruelly. Yet despite the terror, Cedric refused to be quiet. He took to Instagram, to Twitter, to the stage, using every platform he had to shine a light on the abuse his family endured. His fans, used to cryptic poetry and conceptual albums, now saw him unfiltered. And in his rawness, many found courage. He wasn't just speaking for Chrissie. He was speaking for every survivor who had been gaslit, silenced, threatened, or ignored. He was speaking for those whose abusers had power, fame, and followers. Danny Masterson, on the other hand, remained silent initially. Through lawyers, he denied all allegations, calling them false, calling them part of a smear campaign. But the tide was already turning. Cedric's accusation added to a growing list of women who had come forward with eerily similar stories of drugging, sexual assault, and institutional cover-ups. Chrissie was not alone. Her story was a mirror, reflecting a pattern too specific to dismiss. What made Cedric's voice so powerful wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. With fury, yes, but also with clarity. With deep love for his wife and righteous anger for what had been done to her. He didn't care about reputation. He didn't fear retaliation. He stood in the eye of the storm and screamed, hoping the world would finally hear. In the months that followed, more information surfaced. The Los Angeles Police Department confirmed they were investigating multiple allegations against Masterson. The public began to question how such serious accusations had remained hidden for so long. Fingers pointed to the Church of Scientology, to Hollywood executive, to a culture that enabled silence through power. And as Cedric continued to speak, the walls around Masterson began to crack. By 2020, Masterson had been charged with 3 counts of forcible rape. He pleaded not guilty, but the trial brought forward painful testimonies, each echoing Chrissie's, each painting a picture of manipulation, of fear, of silence demanded by a powerful system. The case was not just about Masterson. It was about a culture of silence that had been allowed to fester in the name of celebrity, religion, and money. Through it all, Cedric remained by Chrissie's side. He didn't back down. He didn't disappear after the headlines faded. He kept showing up, angry, broken, but never silent. And that unwavering presence made a difference. It gave Chrissie strength. It gave other survivors courage. And it reminded the world that behind every accusation is not just a victim, but a human being with a family, with scars, with a story that deserves to be heard. In 2017, when Cedric Bixler-Zavala first named Danny Masterson as the man who assaulted his wife, he knew it would change everything. He didn't do it for fame. He didn't do it for revenge. He did it because silence had already done enough damage. And from that moment on, he became more than a musician. He became a witness, a protector, a warrior in a fight no one should ever have to face alone. The weeks following Cedric Bixler-Zavala's public accusation were filled with a strange, suffocating tension. While the world watched headlines unfold, he and Chrissie lived inside a constant state of fear. Every knock at the door felt suspicious. Every unknown number on their phone triggered dread. They were not just dealing with the emotional toll of reopening old wounds. They were navigating a life where safety no longer felt guaranteed. And yet, Cedric refused to be silenced. His voice remained fierce, filled with fire, not reckless, but deliberate. Every word he shared with the public was pointed. Every sentence was a lifeline thrown to others suffering in the same silence his wife had endured for years. He often described how the trauma had never truly left Chrissie, how she would wake up at night gasping for breath, caught in invisible webs of fear, how everyday tasks, even the simple act of stepping outside or going to a store, had become acts of bravery. Cedric watched helplessly as she fought against memories that came like waves, unwelcome, uninvited, and unstoppable. He admitted there were moments when he didn't know what to do, how to help, how to carry the weight that wasn't his but had become his burden too. And in that helplessness, he found rage, not just at Masterson, but at every institution that had told Chrissie to stay quiet. Their anger was not just personal, it was political. Cedric made it clear that this wasn't just about one abuser, but about an entire system designed to protect powerful men and punish the people they hurt. The Church of Scientology loomed like a ghost in their narrative, rarely named by investigators, but always present in every whispered threat and every look over their shoulders. Cedric claimed that every time they spoke up, strange things would happen. Their security cameras would glitch, people would follow them, their phones would act strangely, and then came the ultimate heartbreak, the death of their beloved pets. One of their dogs, a rescue who had brought Chrissie joy during some of her darkest days, was found vomiting blood. Another, only months later, died in similar mysterious circumstances. Cedric believed it was intentional. He didn't mince words. He pointed fingers and said what many wouldn't dare say. They're trying to break us. Whether the allegations about the pet poisonings could be proven or not, one thing was certain. Their world had shifted into something cold and hostile. And yet, Cedric still sang. He still wrote. He still spoke. He poured himself into the music like never before. His lyrics became raw, soaked in anguish and fury. Songs were no longer abstract. They were confrontations. He didn't care who listened. He didn't care about radio play or critical acclaim. He cared about truth. Every show he played became a platform for his pain and his purpose. He dedicated songs to Chrissie, to survivors, to those who couldn't speak but needed to know someone, was shouting for them. Behind the scenes, their legal fight was slow, exhausting, and terrifying. Chrissie was one of several women whose stories about Danny Masterson bore striking similarity, accounts of being drugged, assaulted, and silenced. Many of them, like her, had been part of Scientology. Many had tried to report what happened, only to be told to remain quiet for the good of the church. They were taught that justice is betrayal, Cedric said in one interview, that silence is loyalty, that protecting your abuser is noble. It's the most insidious kind of manipulation. As the case gained traction, Cedric watched the ADA industry's response. Some actors stayed silent. Some quietly distanced themselves from Masterson. Others spoke out in support of the survivors. But the overwhelming feeling Cedric had was disappointment. Too many people seemed more concerned with the scandal's optics than the truth buried beneath it. Too many were afraid to pick a side. And that cowardice only fueled his fight. He didn't want apologies. He wanted accountability, not just from Masterson, but from the machine that enabled him, the studios, the churches, the agencies, the media. For years, they had allowed a culture where victims were ignored and predators were protected. Cedric wanted to burn that culture down. He wanted people to feel uncomfortable, to squirm, to confront the darkness they had helped normalize. Meanwhile, Chrissie's healing was a quiet, brutal journey. Therapy became a lifeline. So did nature. Long walks, animal rescue work, art. She didn't post online often. When she did, it was raw, honest, and vulnerable. She wasn't trying to be an activist. She was trying to survive. But in her survival, many found inspiration. Survivors from around the world began to message her, thanking her, encouraging her, sharing their own stories. And slowly, a community formed. One built not on victimhood, but on strength. Cedric knew the road ahead was still long. Masterson had denied everything. Legal maneuvers slowed the process. Trials were delayed. Motions were filed, but none of it stopped Cedric from speaking. He knew what was true. He had seen what it did to his wife. He had lived with the aftermath, and no amount of legal jargon would change that. He often said that speaking out wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. "Silence is where they live," he once wrote. "Noise is how we survive." And so he kept making noise, through music, through interviews, through love, through the unwavering support he gave to Chrissie, even on the days when she didn't have the strength to speak for herself, and the world was listening. Slowly, painfully, the narrative was shifting. Cedric was no longer seen as a man making noise. He was a man demanding justice in a world that had too often made justice optional, and his voice, steady and unrelenting, would not be silenced. 2021, the case against Danny Masterson had reached a boiling point. After years of allegations, investigations, and a whirlwind of media scrutiny, the courtroom finally opened its doors to the testimonies of women whose voices had been buried for too long. Among them was Chrissie Carnell Bixler, fragile yet fearless, ready to face the man she once trusted, the man she now knew had betrayed her in the most violent way imaginable. Cedric was there every step of the way, not in the shadows, but beside her, holding her hand through the terrifying return to a trauma she had never truly left. He knew that testifying wasn't just about speaking facts. It was about reliving nightmares in front of strangers, in front of her abuser, and in front of a legal system that historically hadn't been kind to women like her. Every morning before court, Cedric would make her tea, sit with her in silence, and remind her of why they had chosen this path. "You don't owe them silence," he would whisper. "You owe yourself peace." And with that, Chrissie would walk into the courtroom with the quiet courage of someone who had already survived the worst. Her testimony was heartbreaking. She spoke of being drugged, of waking up in pain, of confronting Masterson and being met with gaslighting and coldness. She told the court about how, after reporting the assault to the Church of Scientology, she was shamed, threatened, and isolated. They didn't just fail to protect her, they protected him. Cedric sat in the courtroom, fists clenched, eyes full of fire. He wanted to scream, to rage, to call out the hypocrisy of an industry that claimed to support survivors while still employing abusers. But he remained quiet for her. This was her story to tell, and she told it with grace, even as the defense team tried to twist her words, reduce her pain to questions of memory and motive. Cedric watched as the system did what it had always done, doubted her, and yet she did not waver. Outside the courtroom, Cedric continued to speak out. In interviews, in lyrics, in social media posts, he reminded the public that these were not just allegations, they were truths. He challenged other musicians, actors, and fans to stop separating art from morality. "If you stand by him, you're standing on our pain," he wrote. Some called him too emotional, too aggressive, but he didn't care. He wasn't looking for applause. He was looking for justice. During this time, Cedric also became a symbol for male allies, an example of what it looked like when a man stood beside a survivor without taking over her voice. He didn't make it about himself. He didn't frame himself as a hero. He simply stayed. And in that staying, in that loyalty, he offered something more powerful than speeches. He offered presence. As the trial unfolded, more stories came out. Women who had once stayed silent began to speak. Some went public, while others sent messages privately to Chrissie and Cedric. Their words were often the same. "Thank you for speaking up. I thought I was the only one." And that, more than anything, affirmed what Cedric already knew. This fight was bigger than them. It was about systemic change, about unlearning generations of silence and complicity. Masterson's legal team fought hard to discredit the victims. They used tactics that had been seen countless times before, attacking credibility, suggesting ulterior motives, bringing up past relationships as though they were justification. But this time, something was different. The world had changed. The Me Too movement had reshaped public consciousness. The days of silent dismissal were over. People were listening, and more importantly, they were believing. In the evenings, Cedric and Chrissie would return home, exhausted. Sometimes they wouldn't talk. Other nights, they'd cry together. He would hold her as she shook, as the courtroom voices echoed in her mind. And when she couldn't sleep, he'd play guitar softly, gentle melodies that said everything words couldn't. Their home was not peaceful, but it was sacred. A place where pain was met with tenderness, where survival was met with solidarity. As the trial neared closing arguments, Cedric wrote a letter he never published. It was addressed to Masterson. In it, he didn't rage, he didn't insult. He simply described what he had witnessed, his wife's suffering, his family's unraveling, his own descent into grief. He ended the letter with a single sentence. "You didn't just assault her, you tried to erase her." He kept the letter in his guitar case, a reminder of what they were fighting for. Not revenge, not headlines, but recognition, accountability, the basic human decency of being believed. When the jury went into deliberation, time stood still. Days felt like weeks. Every moment was filled with anxious pacing and breathless phone checks. They had no idea how it would end, but they knew that no matter the verdict, they had already done the bravest thing imaginable. They had told the truth. Finally, when the decision came, conviction on multiple counts, Cedric didn't celebrate. He didn't cheer. He simply looked at Chrissie, tears welling in his eyes, and whispered, "You did it." She collapsed into his arms, the weight of years falling from her shoulders in sobs that filled the room. It was not victory. It was validation, a sliver of justice in a world where so many never get even that. In the days that followed, Cedric made only one public statement. "We spoke, we were believed, and now we begin again." It wasn't the end. Healing would take years. The trauma would always linger. But in that courtroom, with truth laid bare and justice served, something had shifted. The silence was broken, the cycle disrupted. And through it all, Cedric remained what he had always been. Not a savior, not a spokesman, but a man who refused to let his wife fight alone. In the aftermath of Danny Masterson's conviction, Cedric Bixler-Zavala and Chrissie Carnell Bixler found themselves in a new kind of silence. Not the suffocating silence of fear and secrecy, but the hollow, stunned silence that follows a long, grueling war. The verdict was public. The world had watched, but only they knew the depth of what it had cost. For so many years, their lives had been haunted by shadow, unspoken truth, private grief, unrelenting anxiety. And now, the man who had shattered their peace was behind bars. It felt surreal. The justice system, so often indifferent to survivors, had finally done what it rarely did, believed them. But even with that vindication, peace didn't return overnight. Chrissie had carried the weight of trauma for over a decade. A single courtroom ruling couldn't erase that. Cedric understood this. He didn't expect healing to be linear. He knew it would come in fragments, some days stronger, some days broken. What mattered now was that they were walking through it together, not in secrecy, not in shame, but in solidarity. In private, they continued therapy, together and separately. Cedric began opening up about his own emotional journey, how helpless he had felt watching Chrissie suffer, how angry he had been at a system that treated survivors like burdens instead of humans, how often he had doubted himself as a husband, a protector, a man. For years, his pain had been channeled into his music, his anger disguised in abstract lyrics and cryptic screams. Now he was learning to speak plainly, to say things like, "I was scared," or "I didn't know what to do." And that vulnerability brought them closer. They began spending more time away from the city, road trips into the desert, quiet cabins tucked away from the world, weekends without phones or headlines. They needed space, not to forget what had happened, but to reclaim something it had nearly taken from them, joy. They laughed more, slept deeper, watched the sky instead of their backs. And for the first time in years, Chrissie began to believe that safety was possible. Cedric started writing again, not just songs, but essays, poetry, personal reflections. He didn't intend to publish them. It was therapy, a way to untangle everything that had been knotted inside him. He wrote about rage, about love, about watching someone you adore disappear into trauma and the long, painful process of helping them come back to life. He wrote about fatherhood, about what it meant to raise children in a world where silence was often mistaken for peace. And he wrote about truth, the price of it, the beauty of it, and the way it changes everything once spoken aloud. As news of the conviction continued to ripple through the media, Cedric was contacted by organizations that supported survivors. They asked him to speak, to write, to lend his voice. He was hesitant at first. He never wanted to become a spokesperson. He feared that by stepping into that role, he might overshadow Chrissie's experience. But she encouraged him. "You're not telling my story," she said. "You're telling yours, and men need to hear it." So Cedric began to speak, at small events, in quiet rooms, never for headlines. He talked about accountability, not as a buzzword, but as a lived experience. He challenged other men to listen, to believe, to unlearn the toxic scripts they'd been handed. He didn't present himself as perfect. He admitted his mistakes, his doubts, his failures. And in that honesty, he created space for others to do the same. Meanwhile, Chrissie continued her own journey. She started painting again, a passion she had abandoned years ago. Her canvases were filled with bold colors, chaotic brush strokes, images of women surrounded by fire and light. It wasn't just art, it was resurrection. Every piece she created was a step back toward herself, toward the parts of her that had been buried beneath fear. She began to smile more freely, to walk, with her head higher, and Cedric watched in awe, not as a man who had saved her, but as one who had refused to leave her side while she saved herself. Their home, once filled with tension and hypervigilance, became a sanctuary. They invited friends over again, cooked dinners, danced in the living room. Their children, still too young to understand the full scope of what had happened, noticed the change. Mom smiled more. Dad laughed louder. The energy shifted. Love, once strained by silence, now bloomed freely. The industry continued to react. Some former colleagues of Masterson issued statements of regret. Others remained quiet. Cedric didn't care anymore. He had stopped expecting courage from those whose comfort depended on compliance. What mattered now was the example he and Chrissie were setting, for their kids, for survivors, for anyone who had ever been made to feel small by someone else's power. Months after the trial, Cedric stood on stage at a benefit concert for survivors of abuse. He held the mic in trembling hand, not from fear, but from the sheer emotion of the moment. "We're not here tonight to be loud," he said. "We're here to be heard, and there's a difference." Then, with nothing more than an acoustic guitar and a heart laid bare, he performed a song he had written for Chrissie. It wasn't angry, it was tender, a ballad about the quiet moments, making tea at midnight, holding hands in the dark, whispering, "You're not broken," over and over until she believed it. The crowd was silent, some in tears, some simply holding one another. And when the final chord rang out, Cedric looked toward the side of the stage, where Chrissie stood, hands over her heart, eyes wet with gratitude. Later that night, someone asked him what justice felt like. He paused, then answered softly, "It's not a gavel, it's not a headline. It's watching someone you love come back to life." And that, more than anything, captured the truth of their journey. It had never been about punishing one man. It had always been about reclaiming what he tried to steal. And now, piece by piece, breath by breath, they were taking it back. The world eventually moved on, as it always does. New scandals emerged, new headlines replaced the old, and the public's attention drifted elsewhere. But for Cedric Bixler-Zavala and Chrissie Carnell Bixler, the journey didn't end with the news cycle. Healing, they learned, doesn't care for closure wrapped in a verdict. It demands consistency, patience, space, and most of all, presence. Danny Masterson's sentencing had brought a form of closure to the case, but it did not erase what had been endured. There were still nights when Chrissie woke in a sweat, pulled back into memories she didn't invite. There were still days Cedric felt rage boil under his skin, at the people who protected abusers, at the ones who stayed silent, at the system that had made justice feel like a miracle rather than a right. But those emotions, once overwhelming, no longer ruled their home. Instead, they were met with understanding and care. Chrissie had grown stronger in ways that didn't always show. It was in her posture, her eye contact, the way she entered a room and didn't shrink anymore. She had become someone who wasn't afraid to take up space, and Cedric admired that endlessly. Watching her return to herself, slowly, beautifully, was the most powerful thing he had ever witnessed. He continued to use his platform with intention. Fame was never the goal, but it became a tool, a loudspeaker he could use to amplify truth. At concerts, he spoke less and played more, but every word mattered. He dedicated songs to survivors. He called out injustice without flinching, and the fans listened, not just to the music, but to the man behind it. His voice had changed. It carried more weight. It no longer screamed for shock value. It spoke because silence had once cost him everything. Interviews came and went. Cedric chose carefully which ones to accept. He wasn't interested in clickbait. He didn't want to reduce Chrissie's story, or the stories of so many others, to headlines or sound bites. When he did speak, he made sure to center the truth, not the scandal. "I'm not here to be famous," he once said. "I'm here to make sure no one else feels as alone as she did." Their children grew, blissfully unaware of the darkness their parents had fought through. Cedric and Chrissie decided early on to shield them from the media, to give them a childhood untouched by pain they didn't choose. It wasn't about hiding the truth. It was about timing. One day, they would tell them everything, honestly, gently, but for now, they protected their innocence. Their home was filled with music, laughter, art, and long conversations about kindness and courage. Every year, on the anniversary of Chrissie's decision to come forward, Cedric did something quiet but meaningful. One year, he took her to the ocean. Another, he surprised her with a journal filled with letters from other survivors who had written to her. They didn't mark the date as one of trauma, but as one of truth, a reminder of the moment she chose to take her power back. She began mentoring other women privately, those who had experienced similar horrors but didn't know where to begin. She listened. She offered support. She reminded them that healing was messy but possible. Her life, once narrowed by pain, had expanded into something powerful, something that gave others hope. In 2024, Cedric released a solo EP. Unlike his previous projects, this one was stripped down, acoustic, intimate. Every track was a reflection of the journey: loss, love, rage, resilience. The final song, For Her, was a soft, haunting ballad written from the point of view of a man learning how to love a woman who'd been broken by another. It ended with a single line that echoed through empty space: "I never saved you, I just stayed." The EP received critical acclaim, but more importantly, it resonated. Listeners wrote in from all over the world. Some were survivors, others were partners. All of them thanked him for the vulnerability, for the honesty, for refusing to look away. Years later, Cedric would reflect on it all: the trauma, the courtroom, the fear, the fire. In a quiet interview on a podcast, he said something simple and profound. "If I could go back, I'd still speak up, even if it cost me everything. Because I watched the person I love most in the world become a ghost of herself, and I'll never stop fighting for her to live freely again." That was the heart of it. It had never been about revenge. It had never been about headlines. It had always been about love, the kind that doesn't run when things get hard, the kind that stands in front of storms and dares them to break it. The legacy of Cedric's voice was not just his music. It was his refusal to be silent, his choice to use his platform for truth, his courage to speak when the world told him to look away. And the legacy of Chrissie's strength was not just her testimony. It was her survival, her healing, her transformation into a woman who stood taller than her pain. Their story wasn't clean. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And in a world full of noise, that truth echoed louder than any lie ever could.